Hi, my name's Eric. I'm one of the guys who's just completed Train the Trainer, and I've found the 6 sessions incredibly helpful. The content has allowed me to think about asking helpful questions, to develop a culture in my groups where people are learning and being vulnerable, and to train planters to plan, implement and sustain gospel growth.
The past 12 weeks or so have been incredible. The material we went through has been brilliant. The online sessions have been great. I, up to this point, have existed in largely the kind of teacher-preacher mode, where when I've tried to communicate or teach something, it's usually delivered with me just speaking at a group of people, and them listening and hopefully absorbing some of what I've had to say.
This material has really challenged me, and I just made an announcement just 2 weeks ago at the church service that we're going to revamp the church's training program. And we're going to move into much more of discussions and application and just where they are really discussing these things and putting into practice these principles that we've been learning here.
It's encouraging to understand that it's not our job as trainers to simply lecture and teach the material, but to create a learning environment in which all of the participants engage and work collectively in order to achieve new information that can be immediately applied in the ministry context.
I remember one of the phrases that stuck, it's still stuck in my mind. It is that, and it is pure gospel, is that the transformation, the church planter transformation, is not depend on us. It's depend on Christ's work.
We always have started our sessions with applying the gospel to our hearts. We can only teach people as deep as we go ourselves. So as we have been together in this great fellowship with wonderful men, and it's been encouraging for me to be with you, and also as I've seen you apply the gospel to your hearts, and it has taught me how to apply the gospel to my heart as well.
You know, I came thinking I'm actually a pretty good trainer, and then I go, actually, I think I was a pretty decent teacher, but I knew nothing about training. And after coming through this, I see such a big contrast between just teaching and training, that there are two different goals. Teaching is part of training, but you can teach and yet not train. And so after going through this with you guys, I really feel at least like the concepts are so much more clear.
It's also provided me with a cohort of like-minded pastors who want to start gospel movements in their cities. And as we share our experiences and the skills that we're developing, it's really encouraging me to continue to spur on to see more people come to know Jesus in my city.
The vision of City Europe is to create movements of the gospel in the cities of Europe. The vision basically describes why we exist. Why do we exist? Well, we do exist because we feel called to the cities of Europe to create movements of the gospel there through church planting. The 21st century is a time when more and more people live in cities, and we see that at the same time, church feels less and less able to do church or to apply the gospel into a young, urban, post-Christian, post-modern, post-secular society. And we do feel called to go to those places and to plant new churches. This is what City was all about from the beginning. Why we exist, why we started what we started. Because some leaders felt called to go to urban places in Europe to create movements of the gospel. Through church planting, this is our very specific contribution. We think a movement of the gospel is more than church planting in the city, but we feel called to contribute the planting of healthy new churches, then in collaboration with the existing churches to seek a movement of the gospel in the city. Our dream, basically, so what we dream and pray about is that we want to see revival. Revival in every city in Europe, in every country. We do believe if we started in the cities, then it will spread out through the whole country, through the whole Europe. And this is what we do. We do train and mentor and equip and coach people who become church planters, who then create churches in order to seek a movement of the gospel in the city and to change the whole city with the gospel. So we exist basically to create those movements of the gospel. And if one day in the future, every city in Europe has a self-running, owned by local people, movement of the gospel through church planting within it, then city doesn't need to exist anymore. But until that day, it needs a network or a movement like City to help those people to create those movements of the gospel. This is the vision of City Europe. Well, City Europe is all about helping people who have a shared vision or want to achieve something that they need help with. So it is, if you want to plant a church, either you are a church planter or someone who wants to be part of a church planting project, or if you and your church have the vision to plant a church, to send someone out to plant a church in a city, and maybe in your city or another city, then City Europe can help you. We are able to help you to first connect you to other leaders in your city or region to get some support there in relationship, in asking questions, in a learning community and something like that. We can help you through the way we train you, how we connect you with a gospel coach, how we can. There's a lot of material, a lot of things that we can help you with specific question, but mainly it is a lot about the relationships. So we can help you to connect you with other people all over Europe or in your city or in your region that help you to plant that church. We believe if you want to plant a church in a city in Europe, then you shouldn't do that alone. You shouldn't do that alone on your own. You need a team, and your team and you need some people around you that support you. So in the best case, you need someone who becomes your mentor, and you're kind of an apprentice or a trainee. You need a trainer, or someone who, or in the best case, actually, there's a learning community that gets trained by someone who's an equipped trainer, and you need a gospel coach. So these are the three relationships that are at least the ones that we would suggest. Sometimes they're not there, but that would be the best case scenario. Saying all of that, we want to support people who want to plant churches or who want to send out church planters, and all the way from identifying, assessing, training, coaching, mentoring, sending out, supporting, multiplying a church. All of that. We want to be a supportive network and movement around that path. And we're quite experienced, and I think we have high quality material and good trained people who can help you on the way. And if you think that is something we can help you with, just connect through our website, connect through our social media, or connect locally with the leaders who are part of City Europe. And we are very eager to help everyone possible who is about creating movements of the gospel in the cities of Europe through planting churches.
Welcome everybody to our City to City Europe Evangelism Project live conversation. I'm very thankful that many of you joined us today, and I have three guests with me today. René from Rome, Stefan from the Netherlands and Amsterdam, and Daniel from Hamburg in Germany. So thank you, the three of you, to join our conversation today. The idea with the Evangelism Project and these live conversations is that we're trying to bring people together to think and talk about the issue of evangelism. So how do we, as people who believe in the gospel, how do we get motivated and equipped to share that beautiful gospel? We at City City, we have a conviction that this gospel is the one thing that we need all the time and everywhere. We want to apply that to our own personal lives, to our churches, to our whole city. And how do we do that? How do we share the gospel with each other, with maybe even people who don't believe it? That's the whole idea. And that, how do we do that in a European urban environment? And we have had a lot of meetings in the last year about that and conversations. And today is another one. And the topic today is, I think, a very interesting one. It is after the last conversations that were a little bit more analytic. So what is actually the problem? Today we're entering the more innovative phase of the conversation, and that is, so what are fresh ideas about, what are approaches how to share the gospel in cities in Europe? That's our conversation today, and I'm again welcoming my guests here. Let me mention before we start the conversation that everybody who's watching can send some questions into our chat. So if you want us to answer a question at the end, or reflect on a thesis that you have, please send it into the chat on Facebook or YouTube, and then we will get these questions. And after 30 minutes of conversation, we have another 15 minutes reserved to answer questions. So please be active in sending us some questions during our conversation. So to my three guests, I begin today with a little opening question of we're entering the season of Lent tomorrow. So we will even say no to a few more things. I mean, being in Corona times made us say no to a lot of things, going to a good restaurant or to a concert or to even meet friends. But now in Lent, do you do Lent? Is that a practice that you follow? And if yes, what do you fast on? Stefan, do you do any fasting in Amsterdam?
Yeah, I quit Twitter for 40 days. Okay. Which is quite a sacrifice for me.
Okay, so you do that more often than I do, it seems like every day.
I think so.
Okay, good. Oh wow. Do you fast in Rome?
I do not actually come from a low church tradition, and usually evangelical Christians here in Italy tend to not be very liturgical, also as a reaction to the very strong liturgy of the Catholic Church. So we celebrate Easter and then Palm Sunday, but we don't do the full stretch usually. So though nothing against that. Yeah.
So do you stay on Twitter active? Or
I do. I hope to. Okay. I hope to be more active than I am usually.
Okay, and Daniel, how about you in Hamburg?
Well, I'm actually fasting. Meat, wine, beer, Twitter, Facebook, like the whole deal. But I tend to never finish fasting well. Okay. So I'm starting, and then after a couple of weeks, I'm like, all right, this is good enough for me. So yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's good. Well, thank you. Yeah, let's switch to our topic today of evangelism, which is how do we find fresh approaches? And I do know that you, Stefan, in your job, you work a lot in research and projects about, and some of them are related to our topic. You shared with me that a project that you're working on now, or just beginning to work on, is about the concept of salvation of people in Europe and how that relates to the issue of evangelism. Definitely, I assume it does. So yeah. Your concept of salvation, believing in the necessity to be saved, for example, probably seems. So what
from that research that you just began, are there any first insights or impressions that you have on how do Europeans want to share the gospel? How is that effective in our age?
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, so we started with a sort of general assumption that missiology or the way you do mission is rooted in certain ideas you have about salvation. So what God does to save people. That seems to be correct. You know, I mean, a lot of people do have those ideas, but they do not really think about it too much. That's one first observation, very preliminary, but what we tend to see, even practitioners, they tend to focus more on issues like how to do it than on issues, why do we do it? Why would you ask anyone to become a Christian, for example? And a second observation, but still, like I said, it's very in the beginning, we need to work it out more, is that especially missionaries or pioneers from an evangelical background, and that's the vast majority, a lot of them tend to become a bit insecure about those issues like why, because they seem to find out that their traditional concepts of evangelism are quite revivalistic in the sense of assuming a sort of Christianized or audience, more or less, that can be revived. Let's say folk church kind of Christianity, nominal Christians. We all know the concepts, but there are fewer and fewer of those people in Europe, more deeply secularized than ever. And then the question is, well, why would we do mission here? What are sort of credible or inspiring concepts of the good life, of human flourishing, of salvation, the future for mankind and all that? And what does God have to do with it? And why did Jesus have to die for it?
Yeah, okay. Does that relate to your reality in Rome and Hamburg, Daniel and René?
I would say that here it's I think there are different mixes in different cultures in Europe, right? Here I think it's probably we can inherit a little bit more of background in terms of a Christianized worldview, even if it is very, very basic, like God exists, Jesus is the Son of God, the Trinity, and the Bible. Though people don't practice and don't come, and then they'll have different issues with the church as an institution. So often when we come in contact with them, it's often like for them it's almost like in a sense a return or a recovery of their past, of their childhood, in which they receive some notions about maybe religion teachings at school or maybe in the parish, and then we can inherit some of them, maybe contrary maybe to what Stefan was saying, though we also are increasingly having also people who come from homes which are not religious at all, don't have much concepts, though the one God, maybe I think everybody would have an assumption as a general assumption in the culture.
Cool. Well, let's focus on the issue of today.
Can I answer?
Okay,
or
sure.
Maybe ask a question back to Stefan, because what you just said made me wonder, like especially your first assumption, if you say maybe I got it wrong, but so that's why I'm asking again. So so more the practitioners, so to speak, of evangelizing Christians just don't need the why so much. Why evangelize? But they're just doing it, right? That's what you said. Maybe a first assumption. But
yeah, well, for many of them, until they reach the point where they don't know the answers anymore, or when they see that their models do not work anymore. So let me give an example. I mean, a lot of, let's say, the most successful evangelical missionaries that I see in the Netherlands, at least, seem to work either among immigrants, so people with a sort of religious background, or if you look at converts, for example, that enter into evangelical churches, almost all of them, not all, but the vast majority are people with church background. So it's revivalistic. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that, but the point is there are fewer and fewer of those people who are socialized in Christian or religious backgrounds. And then what you see is that partly because they see some difficulties in practice, partly because they have some theological developments of their own, these evangelical pioneers enter into a stage of their lives or careers where they start to ask these questions anew. Yeah. So I think, I'm not saying that you need to ask yourself every day, why should people become Christians? We're not always doing soteriology or deep questions about salvation. But I would say when you find out that you're entering a stage in your career where the models or the approaches that you've learned do not really work anymore, or that you start to doubt your own approach, then this may be an issue to work out or to think about.
Mm-hmm. And I would totally disagree that it's an issue to think about. My experiences, by the way, is I'm working with a German church, white German city center, lots of academics and mid-age, me, so to speak, and they need to know the why. Why should we do this? Why should we evangelize before they even go to the how and what? But the why is really.
You disagree? I mean, I would say.
I would say I disagree a little. That
with what exactly?
So at least with my church or people in my church, I think they want to know the why very much. Not so much the missionaries and the pastors, they just go. They basically they grew up with that, and I'm totally agreeing. That's an assumption. I'm not agreeing so far with my members or with my sheep or whatever, because they need to be remembered occasionally or maybe weekly, bi-weekly, of why we are doing this.
Yeah, exactly. Why? Yeah, I agree.
So I'm not so much, but my church needs that very much. So that's why I ask again, and I would say they need to know the why very, very often.
Yeah,
they need to hear it very often.
Yeah.
And remember it in different terms and with different pictures and language and whatever you can. But the why is pretty important for them.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, they just sit there.
Well, so that's why we started this research.
Yeah. Okay.
That's very good.
Good.
So can I ask then, how do we, if the why is so important, what are ways, maybe Daniel or René or Stefan, what are ways, not only practical examples, but what are good approaches to remember people of the why, or to help them to be motivated and equipped towards that? Do you have any good examples of that, or how do you approach that? How do you do that?
Well, I see it's from initial stages of our research and also from my own experience. I mean, what we're talking about here is a rediscovery of the gospel, sort of finding the joy of the gospel again and sharing it and so on. Now, what you see is that most evangelicals are rooted in the revivalistic experiences of the 18th and 19th century, when people started to individualize, went to the cities and rediscovered the gospel in a more democratic, individualistic setting, where you could find assurance, full assurance for yourself and all that. Mm-hmm. Great blessings have come from that, and many people have been converted and turned to God through those experiences. But nowadays we're living in different societies, at least in the West. I'm not talking about Nairobi, or I'm talking about Amsterdam and Hamburg. One of the big issues in our society, for example, is the deep polarization between people. I'm just mentioning one example, the education gap, the gap between ethnicities, nationalist versus globalist people. All these kind of issues are talking about reconciliation and peace. So I think one element of rediscovering the gospel would be what it means to worship a God who is a God of peace, and to talk about Jesus as the Prince of Peace, as actually the early missionaries did when they went to the Germanic people in our part of Europe. They talked about Jesus as the Prince of Peace, all these warring tribes. What I see, and another element what I see from the more, let's say, those missionaries that we have researched now that have gone through a certain re-evaluation of their own theological positions, that they often, I think I'm thinking now of one lady that I know who's a real evangelist. Actually, what she does is she works with people, higher class people mostly, in business or in law or all that kind of stuff. And what she does basically is reading gospel stories with them about vulnerability and openness and so on. It may sound quite simple or maybe even one-sided, but she works with people who have learned all their life to keep up appearances, to be tough. And what she does basically is finding a sort of way where the gospel enters the whole modern or postmodern speech about self-discovery, becoming more open, becoming more vulnerable, and all that. Maybe that's too thin, I'm not sure, but at least it's one way to contextualize. And she, she draws quite a crowd, and a lot of people seem to be blessed by that. It's all experiment. At this point, I'm not judging anything or evaluating anything. I'm just observing and writing down stuff and looking around and see what's happening. But it's just one example. Another example that I know is a guy in Amsterdam who works with artists, probably the most secularized group in Amsterdam, almost all committed atheists. And what he does is experiments. So basically he says, let's just do an experiment with a parable of Jesus. For example, the Good Samaritan. Let's try to do this and then see what happens with us. Basically based on what Jesus says somewhere, that whoever tries to do what I'm teaching shall know that I'm speaking the truth. So a sort of way of learning, evangelizing, not through, let's say, downloading information or trying to change convictions, the mind, so the classic evangelical approach, basically. But by doing things and then talking about it. What did we do? What did we learn about ourselves, about others? And are there stories, texts that make sense of this? So it's very bottom up, very fragmentary, not very systematic, but experience-based. And it seems to work, whatever you define as working, but at least it draws people. They keep listening. They read the Bible. Well, at least some of the things we like to see. Yeah, sorry for the long answer, but
sounds like fresh approaches. How did you see anything helpful, Daniel or René?
Me first. Fresh approaches. I'm right getting there, but I would say answering the question before, like the why, or from the why to the how. I think focusing on the gospel is a very, very good start. And I think that rediscovering the gospel gives us the next generation of people who maybe the last two generations lost a little, church generations have some problems with some bigger problems with evangelizing missionaries. And I would say today, as we are focusing the gospel, rediscovering the gospel again, what happens is, here's an example. If you you have some churches who are more like, let's say, they hate the world so much, they wouldn't mix with the church, and they are scared of the church. They wouldn't go out to the church, to the world. So they are just separating. They're internally focused. They wouldn't mix up with non-Christians so much, because we are holy, the holy ones. You have these kinds of churches, and then you have on the other side the churches who are really like, they're very liberal and they want to reach people, and they basically do anything they can to make it more lofty and nice, and they're trying to catch people in some sense. So in the gospel, rediscovering the gospel is an answer to both approaches, because you will, if you are separating from the world, you will reach no one. If you are too much of the world, if you are like the world, why should anybody believe that Jesus was sent by the Father, that Jesus is so different, that Jesus comes from heaven to earth, that he brings something totally new? So the gospel is an answer to both groups, because you have, the gospel teaches, man, you are more sinful than you ever believed, and so why you can't be just like proud, or you can't separate yourself, because you are as sinful as anybody else. If you get what the gospel teaches about sin and your failure and where you stand before Jesus, you can't just separate you. You can't just think you're better than the rest, and you can't just be the holy ones. The only thing which is distinctive with you is you are saved. That's it. and that's the answer to them. And Jesus calls them into ministry and calls them into be sent ones. And then on the other side, you have like all these people who are like the high and lofty ones, or the very liberal ones, and all that. And you can tell them, hey, you want to be appreciated by the world. You want to see the world. You want to be as attractive as the world and catch people. No, the God loves you so much because what he did on the cross, that you don't need anybody else's affirmation. You have it already. You don't need the affirmation of the world. You don't need the affirmation to be cool and hip, the best church in town. So the gospel, rediscovering the gospel, that's just one example, but focusing on the rest of the gospel and rediscovering it is an answer to both groups, which brings us back to the roots of the gospel. And if you teach that, if you bring that to your people, what's access, and just so many people just saw it and started to believe in the gospel, just because you were focused on the gospel, just because you taught them and you taught them. And that's beautiful. And that's what I see happening.
What I really like about what you're saying, Daniel, is that what you're telling here is to relocate the gospel in a practice of peace building, basically. That's what I hear, at least. What you want to do is, well, at least you want to help people, either whether they are high and lofty, or lower class, or whatever they think about themselves, to build peace. And what you talk about is you can't do that without the gospel. That's basically what you're saying, right?
Exactly.
And so maybe that's one thing that I was hinting at just before. You need to find practices, basically things you do, like building peace, building bridges, in order for the gospel to make sense again for late modern people. Because the average person in at least in Northwestern Europe is not very interested in a sort of idea that you need the gospel. Why do I need it? Well, maybe you get to heaven or whatever. But how can I live together with other people? And even if you don't want it, because many people do not really want that, we all like our cozy bubbles. Then still, if I think the gospel starts to make wonderful sense at the very point, once we embark on projects of real peacemaking, because then we find that we are entering the realm of the impossible. We can't do it. Basically, we can't do it. Not really. We can make some community with people who are like us, or some people are below us, so to speak, we can bow down to, and being paternalistic about them. But real community between so many different people like we have in today, it's impossible. And that's where the gospel, I think, starts to make sense again for many people, at least for a few.
At least for a few. And it answers those questions. I mean, we are, if we evangelizing, we're answering the question, every so often we're answering the question of, you are a sinner, God needs to save you. But the people don't ask the question at all. They don't ask the question about their sinfulness, or why do I need a God to save me? They don't think as a sinner of themselves. They think as good people. But when it comes to community, when it comes to peace, when it comes to not separating parties so much, or the rich and the poor, or genders, or anything you just said, the gospel comes in, or can come in terms of a gospel-centered church, and shows them and teaches them and talks with gospel words and all that. And that's something I grasp a little, but I would love to see more.
Yeah, so do I.
Good. Yeah.
Well, René, in your life, how do you, if you try to share the gospel with people, whoever, in what way, how do you find helpful approaches to that?
Yes, good question. What I was having in mind as you guys were talking, I think I agree with everything was said, and how it needs to be embodied and celebrated. And in our culture here, since I don't know how it is your guys' traditions in the Netherlands and in Germany, but here a Catholic Church baptizes babies, right? So everybody's baptized as a child. So for us, a big deal has become people seeing adults get baptized when they come to faith. And so we do a service outside the city. We go to a lake, a beautiful lake outside of Rome, and people share their testimonies and baptize people in their 40s, their 60s, their 20s. And it's very moving for people to see, to invite their family members to. And it's a very concrete act in which people get a glimpse and start thinking about. So I think when they start to see some life change and some the gospel being spoken by not only by the official person like the pastor, but by their friends or people in the community, I think it starts to make sense. And they start to raise some questions that have and what we try to do, we try to answer your question, Stefan, to have a process, a clear process in which people who are willing to explore can have a way of coming into the process. Like we know there are several approaches around, like Christianity Explored or Alpha. We use something called Seeker's Bible Study, which is just like getting people coming at home. We try to do good hospitality in terms of being a welcoming home and food and all that. And people ask them to share their story. So people introduce themselves and share their backgrounds in terms of faith and what they believe. And then we start to see these very basic stories in the Gospels. So Jesus meeting the Samaritan woman or Nicodemus or the prodigal son, these very key stories, and having conversations around them. And in that sense, the gospel, Jesus starts to come alive, kind of almost like leaping off the page, right? Because we're talking about that, people are asking questions, trying to see themselves in that scene. And so I think it's a wonderful process when they see something happening in front of them, and the community welcomes them, becomes a witnessing community, and then can get a chance of interacting, asking questions, and being part of a group which explores this together.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that. So many of the effective things that I've seen are more in a community, and they're more about a conversation than just a monologue that I react to or something like that. So
yes,
like
yes, very much. I think
and a dialogue involved. Yeah, is that
very much? Yeah, I think I'm for all possible ways, like individual conversations, sometimes event-based preaching or something. But at least in our case here in our culture, which is a very relational culture, these groups which are very relational, people start talking and sharing, having conversations around the text, are very effective because they're in, right? They're participating, they're saying their piece, and I think it's the thing. This seed, as Jesus says, starts to come into the ground and into the people's hearts.
Good. Well, before we go into some questions that people might want to ask, and then we already got a few, and if you want to ask some more, please send them to the text now so I can ask them to our three guests in a minute. Daniel, Stefan, and René, if you think about the moments for your own, like if you have the opportunity to apply the gospel to a person or in a conversation, it might be someone who's totally new to the concept, or maybe even someone who has heard it a lot. What are helpful approaches to that? You know, what I mean, maybe you can think of some old approaches that don't work anymore, like our grandparents used, but probably there are new ones that you maybe have tried out. Or I mean, how is there anything that you could give as probably that could give it like a 2-hour answer. We don't want that now, but is there anything that you found helpful? Daniel, if you meet guys in Hamburg, how do you do that? Is there anything helpful that you found?
Surprisingly, I think I found the new thing. And the new thing is the old thing, because what I experienced in the last couple of years is that there's nothing new under the sun, and that's very maybe challenging for some of you listeners. But I think that some old approaches Christians used for 2,000 years are still, if you rediscover the gospel, and then if you do friendship evangelism, which is nothing new, or if you do a Bible reading with some friends, which is nothing new, if you have a conversation about some topics totally off Bible, some like for example Stefan Paas does a podcast on art and on these things, and they argue and they discuss it, and which is not new. The Greeks did it. so Paul took that the first podcast and basically discussed with and always brought Jesus into the game, and always. So I'm thinking right now, this is just an observation for quite some while. I'm thinking, and you can come up with great creative things, and some might be news, but some might be old, but with a new gospel approach which we rediscovered, a peace approach or whatever, and that your heart changes, your attitude changes, your words change, and it might sound new, but some of the approaches are old. So I would say friendship evangelism with a rediscovered gospel is so effective. It's so great. If people just melt because of the gospel, and then talk with their friends, live with their friends, and share the gospel if they ask them about it, and so I mean, I could go on. Like there are tons of examples, and you could of course teach your church some of the some old apologetics or whatever. Yeah, that would be my answer.
Okay.
It's not like the new thing, but I think in some old things, with a new heart, it seems very new, but it's and it's effective. René
Okay.
or Stefan.
Yeah, I think I agree by and large. I mean, I think it would be a mistake to think that we would need to find a silver bullet or a new recipe for doing evangelism. I mean, Christianity, the good news of Christianity, as everything is very difficult to put into one formula for all times and ages. In a way, it's always, again, the question, what does the good news mean here and now? So in the context where I'm working, like I said, it has a lot to do with the deep polarization, affective polarization, as we call it. It's not just that people disagree, they hate each other because they disagree. So one of the issues for me, for example, let me just take myself as an example, how I would learn that I'm a sinner, and that I need forgiveness. Unfortunately, there is when I come into contact with people who are politically very different. For example, right-wing nationalists, or people who vote for right-wing nationalist parties. Let me just call a spade a spade. I tend to find such people very difficult. But I know as a Christian, I have to love my enemies. Not just my enemies, some of these people are my fellow Christians. So that's where it begins, probably, the work of reconciliation, peace building, and learning anew what it means that the gospel is preached in this world and that Christ has come and died and resurrected. Well, as soon as I put it in that context, then it starts to come alive. See my point? So basically, I think when it comes to evangelism, I'm not much of an evangelist myself. I mean, I think a lot of people who listen to this broadcasting are much better at evangelism than I am. But just from my own humble perspective, I would say the point probably is not whether we know the gospel or know some formula or new ways to phrase it. The point is that we're often far too comfortable in our lives and in our comfort zones, and we're not put at the spot where it begins to hurt and where we begin to feel quite helpless and start praying and need this forgiveness and this love of Christ. Yeah, and then, I mean, to put it on more domestic plane, so to speak, Daniel mentioned the podcast. One of the things I've recognized again is how important it is, you can't overestimate it, how important it is to listen to people. One of the things I've learned throughout the podcast, where we invite all sorts of people from the Netherlands, mostly non-Christians, we talk about art and politics, and I'm just sitting there as a theologian and I put in some perspectives of my own. How much people appreciate that there is an honest conversation, not a conversation with a hidden agenda. Basically, it's two people or three people meeting each other and talking about things they like, they love, and putting in different life perspectives because they have different life views and worldviews. And the emails I get and the WhatsApps that I get after the podcast, and my colleague David Boger, the journalist who actually chairs these podcasts, the kind of messages he gets, it seemed to point that we have found a sort of, soft spot in culture, so to speak, that a lot of people like that. They say, well, I didn't know that Christians could be like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's my last point. That's one thing I've always thought, actually. Whenever I was in a Christian meeting with some very nice and great people, they just, and after the meeting, they just started to talk with each other, like the Dutch say, with their legs on the table, basically relaxed and just talking about all sorts of things they like. I was always thinking, you just need to put it in a microphone and broadcast it, and people would see what wonderful people these people are. But as soon as they start to evangelize, then sort of becomes rigid and becomes, but if they just talk and share their lives, then it's deeply it's fun and it's nice and it's good to listen to. So basically that's what we do. We just put a few people together, one or two Christians and in the mix and just start talking.
Yeah. I think just if I can add something, I think it's a great example. I found that it's like you're just being real and not trying to come with a framework or a formula, but just being interested in people's lives and asking questions. First asking questions, listening, and then trying to answer as questions might come, right? Instead of coming with the answers in the beginning. And also trying to be vulnerable and humble in a sense. I think of, for example, Jesus, who came to meet the Samaritan woman, right? He could criticize a lot, and he had a lot to offer. But first he asked for help. He asked for a cup of water, right? So he came in that posture, and she helped him. And then they started a conversation around their life and that moment right there, right? So I think asking questions and being vulnerable, being at the same level with people, it helps a lot.
Okay.
Sure. And I mean, it's not a method, you know. I mean, this is basically what people should do all the time. Yeah.
Cool. Very good conversation. Let's not stop it, but I want to bring in a question or two from our chat, and maybe one or two of you can react to that. So the one is, it was mentioned that evangelism is or was a conviction change, but that's not that much anymore. But how, if evangelism is not changing convictions, how can that be evangelism? So it's a little bit of a provocative question.
Who's the question asked to?
Whoever wants to respond. I think Stefan. You mentioned the thing.
It's to Stefan Paas.
Did I wake up sleeping dogs here? Well, in Greek, it's metanoia, which is a change of mind, if you would translate it literally. But all sorts of words behind it, like Hebrew shuv, which means a complete direction of life. So it's more than just convictions. It's a change of life and all that. So I'm not saying that conversion does not include changed opinions or changed views. The point perhaps is more where to start. So as long as you can assume a sort of Christianized or Christian socialization in the background, like you seem to have, René, in your context, then it may be that you just need to start to change some opinions, some views. You think this about God, but actually this is not right. You need to think that about God. Or you think this about the Bible, but actually you should do stuff like that. But in a deeply secularized or pagan environment, that's not there. So where do you start? In one way or another, it starts to help people to see that it makes sense at all to talk about God and Jesus. So that's where you start, basically.
Yeah. I would. So this is what I teach my church. So in the you wouldn't start with convicting people or with this is how we did it in the past. You know, if you don't convert, you go into hell. It's like turn or burn, right? So we're not going to do this anymore because it's like, or you come with the law, you come with the Bible, and you got to believe this, otherwise you go to hell and all that. You come in with a baseball bat and with full swing, you just hit their face. They don't like that. So and the cross doesn't really, yeah, good, I need the cross. But so how we do it is, or how I teach my church, we could evangelize, is we starting with the beauty of Christ. We starting with the person and the work and the character and the personality of Jesus Christ, with the beauty of this God, this human, this everything. And in all words and colors and everything, you describe how he lived, how he worked, what his answers are to the problems of life, blah, blah, blah. As you do that, you will see very quickly that you're not like him. Which brings you to self-conviction, so to speak. So without convicting people, we can say, this is Jesus and we are not like him. I'm not like him.
Mm.
No one is like him.
Hmm.
And the more you do that, the more you see how my ego is basically driving me to hell.
Okay.
And then I need the cross, and the cross is the solution for, like getting back. And it makes even Jesus bigger and greater and more beautiful. So it's a circle. But we're not starting with the ego or with convicting people anymore. We're starting with the beauty of Jesus. And sometimes it takes longer for people to understand why they need the cross. But that's how we do it. Anyway.
Good. Here's another question. Maybe René can start answering that. Is there something that you were really excited about to make work in terms of sharing the gospel, and then it was a total disaster?
Oh, a total disaster.
Is there something that you thought this will work, and then it didn't work?
I can be honest. I thought that some evangelistic events we tried putting together, which you had very good content I worked on, which I was very proud of. Not that they were too bad, but if you just put on a party, like we did a 1970s party, like with songs from the 70s, and it was a smashing success, right? People loved it. Like people in their 50s, they came with their what do you call it, their hair, colored hair, and the songs clothes from that age. It was a smashing success, much more than our with good content events. Or we did an event for a Tex-Mex, people like just cooking like a Tex-Mex food. Or well, another thing which was a smashing success was an idea which the women did by Women for Women. It was an event on the International Day of Women in which they invited the women. I thought it was a very good idea to come and write on their bodies, their faces, their hands, a message they want to share to other women. And so lots of women came, that they wanted to say something to the others, have a good picture taken of them, so the good memory. And it was a wonderful, like lots of people came, lots of people who didn't believe, they shared something, and then they were much more willing to hear someone say their own things, like what the other women said. And it was a wonderful conversation that they did, and I wasn't involved with that at all. So like some good ideas, which often I think we come from a perspective like what can I say, what can I share, and which is of course great, but often like just getting people together like in a party or this kind of conversations can be a very good starting point as well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's good, to be honest, and I think that's also a gospel reality. If we're honest and vulnerable, you mentioned that before about our failures. That's often a good starting point of a gospel conversation. Yeah. Well, our time is over. There's a little question that was asked, and maybe Stefan, you can help us with that. Some people asked if there's an opportunity to find some of the things that you're processing or the research that you did. Is there a way that people can find that? Or
yeah,
we can put that in the chat.
If you look at my academia page, there's a lot of articles there, academia.edu.
Okay. Well, we will make sure that maybe you can send us some of the links, and we will just put them on the page and on the chat here, so you can find that later on.
Yeah, if the person who asked this has a specific question about, because there's so much, then I will be happy to answer any question. Good. You know my email address, so let this person just pop me an email, and I'll overload him or her with articles and everything.
Very good. Sounds great. So thank you very much, René, Stefan, and Daniel. I think this was a rich gospel conversation. We heard the gospel even in our conversation a few times today, which is a good sign for me. If we apply the gospel even here about the question, how do we apply the gospel? And that is good. So thank you for your conversation. There will be more of these kind of conversations. The next one is going to be on March 8th, and it's going to be about stories. So are there encouraging examples of sharing the gospel in Europe? So that will be our next conversation with another set of guests. And if you haven't been able to watch the last ones, you will find them at our blog or website. And yeah, we hope that this conversation and the things that we do at City Europe kind of contribute a little bit towards our vision, which is We want to help people to create movements of the gospel in their lives, in their churches, in their communities, in their cities. And that is hopefully something inspiring and informing and encouraging today. So thank you for joining today, and goodbye to the next conversation.